Okay, we'll excuse me. We'll get started here. I hope everybody had a nice Pesach, nice Passover, and you're recuperating from all the matzah. I'll start just a quick review of this week's coming Torah portion. It's called Achrei Mot because the opening words, Achrei Mot, Shnei Bnei Aaron, that takes place after the death of Aaron's two sons, who brought a strange fire to the sanctuary. And then what follows is a description of the service that was to purify, sanctify the tabernacle from any kind of ritual impurity that may have come in contact with it. And this course serves as the heart of the service that took place in the temple for Yom Kippur. And obviously, our observance of Yom Kippur has changed from the concentration on the temple or the tabernacle to examining our own tabernacle, our own lives, and trying to remove any kind of impurities that have seeped into our lives. But the temple ritual is described in basic detail in the Torah portion, and then is followed by what is called the Holiness Code, various aspects of life that the Torah demands that we act in a certain way so that we should be holy, right? Including sexual practices, which is an important element of that as well. All right, this week is Holocaust Memorial Day. This was established by the Knesset. It's really to remember both the suffering and the heroism. Yom HaGvura as well, the days of heroism from those Jews who sought to fight back against the Nazis in whatever way they could. We'll touch upon that as we go on this evening. So we really want to talk about the Holocaust, its impact on Jewish faith and Jews in general. One of the things that is important to note that one of the largest survivor communities was here in Canada. Many those who survived the Holocaust made their way to Canada. It was a very large percentage of the Canadian Jewish community was made up of Holocaust survivors. And as a result, it very much impacted the people here in Toronto and Montreal. So that's an element of it as well. And we're seeing now what is happening is that slowly but surely the Holocaust survivors are disappearing. Pre-COVID, one of the things that we used to do for this class was that we would go to the Holocaust Museum here in Toronto, and a survivor of the Holocaust would be part of that presentation. I hope that we may be able to do that again in the future, because what I have to say on a historical basis really cannot replace the words of somebody who went through it. And we know that everyone who experienced the Holocaust on their personal level came out differently from somebody else. Those who went into the Holocaust as firm believers and came out as deniers of religion. Others came out even more strong in their religious faith. And everybody in between. So there is no one story of the Holocaust. There's no one story of how people survived the Holocaust. There are millions of stories, and there are 6 million whose story ends with the Holocaust. What was unique in Jewish history, and really in human history, which made the Holocaust what it was, is when it was a systematic bureaucratic annihilation of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and their collaborators as a central act of state during World War II. I mean, this was something that was systematized, bureaucratized, record keeping. You all are familiar with the idea that the inmates would have numbers tattooed on their arms so that they could be kept track of. And that's what is one of the outrageous aspects of it. We know of other massacres and genocides in human history, some that are taking place even in our own day and age. But nothing was so systematic, so much a part of the state policy as what took place under the Nazis. In 1933, approximately 9 million Jews lived in the 21 countries of Europe that would be occupied Germany during the war. By 1945, 2 out of every 3 European Jews had been killed. Although Jews were the primary victims, hundreds of thousands of Roma and at least 250,000 mentally or physically disabled persons were also victims of Nazi genocide. As Nazi tyranny spread across Europe from 1933 to 1945, millions of other innocent people were persecuted and murdered. More than 3 million Soviet prisoners of war were killed because of their nationality. Poles, as well as other Slavs, were targeted for slave labor, and as a result, almost 2 million perished. Homosexuals and others deemed antisocial were also persecuted and often murdered. In addition, thousands of political and religious dissidents, such as communists, socialists, trade unionists, Jehovah's Witnesses, were persecuted for their beliefs and behavior, and many of these died as a result of their maltreatment. The concentration camp is most strongly associated with the Holocaust and remains an enduring symbol of the Nazi regime. The first camps opened soon after the Nazis took power in January 1933, and they continued as a basic part of Nazi rule until May 8, 1945, when the war in the Nazi regime ended. All right, so when we look at the events of the Holocaust, we see there really were 2 main phases, according to many historians. 1933 through 1939, and then 1939 through 1945. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was named Chancellor, the most powerful position in the German government, by the aged President Hindenburg, who hoped Hitler could lead the nation out of its grave political and economic crises. Hitler was the leader of the right-wing National Socialist German Workers' Party, called the Nazi Party for short. It was, by 1933, one of the strongest parties in Germany, even though reflecting the country's multi-party system, the Nazis had only won a plurality of 33% of the votes in the 1930 elections to the German parliament, the Reichstag. So for those who know something of the history of that period of time, it was a very difficult period for much of the world, Germany too. Germany had to deal with the reparations that were imposed upon it by the victorious Allies in World War I. It had undergone tremendous upheaval, and there were Nazis, there were communists, socialists, various political parties that vied for power. And the Weimar Republic, which preceded the Nazi rule, was a weak system and eventually collapsed under Hitler. Once he's in power, Hitler moves quickly to eliminate democracy. He convinced his cabinet to invoke emergency clauses of the Constitution, which permitted the suspension of individual freedoms of the press, speech, and assembly. The special security forces, the special state police, the Gestapo, the stormtroopers, the SA, and the security police, the SS, murdered or arrested leaders of opposition political parties, communists, socialists, liberals. The Enabling Act of March 23rd, 1933, forced through a Reichstag already purged of many political opponents, gave dictatorial powers to Hitler. Right, so let's remember, it starts off as a democratic system. And in any parliamentary system, the party with the most votes is usually asked to form the government. When they don't have a majority, they have to deal with coalitions, deal with other members of the parliament, in this case, the Reichstag. So, Hitler was dependent upon others' votes. But by eliminating them, by getting rid of many of these people who are in the Reichstag, he thus changes the whole circumstance. And so he has enough votes to do whatever he wants. And so to be declared the Führer, the dictator of Germany, was what he was able to do. And also in 1933, the Nazis began to put into practice their racial ideology. Echoing ideas popular in Germany as well as most other Western nations well before the 1930s, the Nazis believed that the Germans were racially superior, and there was a struggle between them and inferior races. They saw Jews, Roma, and the handicapped as serious biological threats to the purity of the German Aryan race, what they called the master race. And so this ideology, this racial ideology, was part and parcel of their political vision. It was part and parcel of what Hitler had dreamed up. It was a racial one. In other words, it wasn't the Jews as a religion. It was the Jew as a person. Jews constituted not a religious element of the German people. Jews constituted a separate people, a separate nation, a separate race. And they were a plague, a disease in the heart of the German race. That's Hitler in a nutshell, in his ideology in a nutshell. The Jews, who numbered around 500,000 in Germany, which was less than 1% of the total population in 1933, were the principal target of Nazi hatred. All right? They blamed the Jews for Germany's economic depression, the country's defeat in World War I. And so slowly, they enacted rules, laws that more and more took away Jewish rights and more made them into pariahs of society. One of the ways to destroy an element in society is to dehumanize them. If they're not really on the same level as you are, they can be regarded as vermin, and no different than rats, which is what Nazi propaganda spoke to. So in 1933, new German laws forced Jews to quit their civil service jobs, university and law court positions, and other areas of public life. In April 1933, a boycott of Jewish businesses was instituted. In 1935, laws proclaimed stripped German Jews of their citizenship, even though they retained limited rights. These Nuremberg laws defined Jews not by their religion or by how they wanted to identify themselves, but by the blood of their grandparents. Now, one of the things that was different in the modern anti-Semitic armory of ideas was this idea, by racializing the identification of the Jew, you cannot escape being Jewish. Amongst the rulings, these Nuremberg laws, as I said, they defined a Jew not as someone with particular religious beliefs. Instead, anyone who had three of his four grandparents were Jews, regardless of whether that individual identified himself or herself as a Jew. or belonging to Jewish religious communities. Many Jews who had not practiced Judaism for decades found themselves caught in the grip of the Nazi terror. Even people with Jewish grandparents who had converted to Christianity was defined as Jews. Okay? Now, for a brief period after Nuremberg, the weeks before and during the 1936 Olympic Games, which were held in Berlin, which many Jews sought to have boycotted, the Nazi regime actually moderated its anti-Jewish attacks and even removed some of the signs saying Jews unwelcome from public places. Because Hitler didn't want international criticism of his government to result in the loss of the games. And the Olympic Committee went along with it, much to the shame of the Olympic Committee. After the Olympic Games, in which Nazis did not allow general Jewish athletes to participate, they again stepped up their persecution of the Jews. Right? So between 1937 and 1939, new anti-Jewish regulations segregated Jews further and made daily life exceedingly difficult for them. Jews could not attend public schools, go to theaters, cinemas, or vacation resorts, or reside or even walk in certain sections of German cities. Also, between 1937 and 1939, Jews were forced from Germany's economic life. Nazis either seized Jewish businesses and properties outright or forced Jews to sell them at bargain prices. And this includes how some of the artwork that had been owned by Jews ended up in the hands of others, and even today are now being fought over by the descendants of the original Jewish owners. But these artworks are now found in museums and become a very constant source of distress even till today. In November 1938, this economic attack against German and Austrian Jews, by which time Austria had been absorbed into Germany, changed into the physical destruction of synagogues and Jewish-owned stores, the arrest of Jewish men, the destruction of homes, and the murder of individuals. This centrally organized riot pogrom became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Now, as we pointed out, Jews are not the only ones who were targeted by the Nazis. And this ideology, this racial ideology, meant that they sought to have selective breeding to improve the human race. Laws between, especially the German race, laws passed between 1933 and 1935 aimed to reduce the future number of genetic inferiors through involuntary sterilization programs. About 500 children of mixed African German racial backgrounds and 320,000 to 350,000 individuals judged physically or mentally handicapped were subjected to surgical or radiation procedures so they could not have children. Supporters of sterilization also argued that the handicapped burdened the community with the cost of their care. Many of Germany's 30,000 Roma were also eventually sterilized and prohibited, along with Blacks, from intermarrying with Germans. Reflecting traditional prejudices, new laws combined traditional prejudices with the new racism of Nazis, which defined the Roma, also called Gypsies, by race as criminal and asocial. Another consequence of Hitler's ruthless dictatorship in the 30s was the arrest of political opponents and trade unionists, and others the Nazis labeled undesirables and enemies of the state. Many homosexuals, mostly male, were arrested and imprisoned in concentration camps. Under the 1935 Nazi revised criminal code, the mere denunciation of an individual as homosexual could result in arrest, trial, and conviction. Jehovah's Witnesses were banned as an organization as early as April 1933, since the beliefs of this religious group prohibited them from swearing any oath to the state or serving in the German military. Their literature was confiscated, and they lost jobs, unemployment benefits, pensions, and all social welfare benefits. Many members of this group were sent to prisons and concentration camps in Nazi Germany, and their children were sent to juvenile detention homes and orphanages. Between 1933 and 1936, thousands of people, mostly political prisoners and Jehovah's Witnesses, were imprisoned in concentration camps, while several thousand German Roma were confined in special municipal camps. Now, the first systematic roundup of German and Austrian Jews occurred after Kristallnacht, when approximately 30,000 Jewish men were deported to Dachau and other concentration camps, and several hundred Jewish women were sent to local jails. At the end of 1938, the waves of arrests also included several thousand German and Austrian Roma. Between 1933 and 1939, about half the Jewish population and more than 2/3 of Austrian Jews fled Nazi persecution. They emigrated mainly to Palestine, the United States, Latin America, China, which required no visa for entry, and Eastern and Western Europe, where many would be caught up again in the Nazi net during the war. Jews who remained under Nazi rule were either unwilling to uproot themselves or unable to obtain visas, sponsors in host countries, or funds for immigration. Most foreign countries, including the United States, Canada, Britain, and France, were unwilling to admit exceptionally large numbers of refugees. Famously, I forget his name right now, but the Minister of State in here, Foreign Affairs, basically said one is too many, referring to Jews coming into Canada at that time. So some Jews fled when they could, wherever they could. Some Jews just didn't have the wherewithal to do it. Some, unfortunately, didn't really believe what was happening was happening. And so they did not leave thinking this would pass. One of the tragedies the Jewish community faced during the Holocaust was the fact that many did not realize that what worked in the past would not work today. That, a few people being beaten up, a few people being killed, and then it would pass by, was not what's going to take place. Okay, so that's the first half of the story. It was not out and out murders of Jews in general. It was not out and out concentration camps for all Jews or work camps for all Jews, but it was slow tightening of the noose. It was a slow denigration of the Jewish communities. It was a slow dehumanization process. And those who were caught on it and couldn't get away from it, more and more got swept up and felt helpless to do anything to stop what was going on. Okay, so now in 1939, Germany invades Poland and World War II begins. Within 1 month, the Polish army was defeated, and the Nazis began their campaign to destroy Polish culture and enslave the Polish people whom they viewed as subhuman. Killing Polish leaders was the first step. German soldiers carried out massacres of university professors, artists, writers, politicians, and many Catholic priests. To create new living space for the superior Germanic race, large segments of the Polish population were resettled, and German families moved into the emptied lands. Thousands of other Poles, including Jews, were imprisoned in concentration camps. The Nazis also kidnapped as many as 50,000 Aryan-looking Polish children from their parents and took them to Germany to be adopted by German families. Many of these children were later rejected as not capable of Germanization or sent to special children's camps where some died of starvation, lethal injection, and disease. As war began in 1939, Hitler initialed an order to kill institutionalized handicapped patients deemed incurable. Special commissions of physicians reviewed questionnaires filled out by all state hospitals, and then decided if a patient should be killed. The doomed were then transferred to 6 institutions in Germany and Austria, where specially constructed gas chambers were used to kill them. After public protests in 1941, the Nazi leadership continued this euphemistically termed euthanasia program in secret. Babies, small children, and other victims were thereafter killed by lethal injection and pills and by forced starvation. The euthanasia program contained all the elements later required for the mass murder of European Jews and Roma in Nazi death camps. An articulated decision to kill, especially trained personnel, the apparatus for killing by gas, and the use of euphemistic language like euthanasia, which psychologically distanced the murderers from their victims and hid the criminal character of the killings from the public. In 1940, German forces continued the conquest of much of Europe, moving westward, defeating Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. June 22nd, 1941, the German army then invaded the Soviet Union, and by September was approaching Moscow. In the meantime, Italy, Romania, and Hungary had joined the Axis powers led by Germany and opposed by the Allied powers, British Commonwealth, the Free French, later at that time, later in the United States, and the Soviet Union. In the months following the Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, Jews, political leaders, communists, and many Roma were killed in mass executions. The overwhelming majority of those killed this way were Jews. These murders were carried out at improvised sites throughout the Soviet Union by members of mobile killing squads, Einsatzgruppen, who followed in the wake of the German army. The most famous of the sites was Babi Yar near Kiev, where an estimated 33,000 persons, mostly Jews, were murdered. I apologize. The other day, watching the news about what's been going on in Ukraine, they mentioned, I think it was Babi Yar. I apologize. Apparently, that is the Ukrainian version of Babi Yar. And it took me a while before I understood that's what it was. And that's outside of Kiev, and some monuments that were there have been destroyed by Russian artillery and missiles. Okay, so now German terror extended to institutionalized handicapped and psychiatric patients in the Soviet Union. It also resulted in the mass murder of more than 3 million Soviet prisoners of war. World War II brought major changes to the concentration camp system. Large numbers of new prisoners deported from all German-occupied countries now flooded the camps. Often entire groups were committed to the camps, such as members of underground resistance organizations who were rounded up in a sweep across Western Europe under the 1941 Night and Fog Decree. To accommodate the massive increase in the number of prisoners, hundreds of new camps were established in occupied territories of Eastern and Western Europe. During the war, ghettos, transit camps, and forced labor camps, in addition to concentration camps, were created by the Germans and their collaborators to imprison Jews, Roma, and other victims of racial and ethnic hatred, as well as political opponents and resistance fighters. Following the invasion of Poland, 3 million Polish Jews were forced into approximately 400 newly established ghettos, where they were segregated from the rest of the population. A large number of Jews were also deported from other cities and countries, including Germany, to ghettos in Poland and German-occupied territories further east. In Polish cities under Nazi occupation like Warsaw and Lodz, Jews were confined in sealed ghettos where starvation, overcrowding, exposure to cold and contagious diseases killed tens of thousands of people. In Warsaw and elsewhere, ghettoized Jews made every effort, often at great risk, to maintain their cultural, communal, and religious lives. One of the ways of resistance is to go on living, go on creating plays, writing poetry, playing music, attending Talmud lectures, Jewish lectures of all sorts. And these took place in the ghettos. And sometimes they risked their lives to do these things. And the ghettos, besides being a place to concentrate Jews, was also provide a forced labor pool for the Germans. And many forced laborers who worked on road gangs and construction and other hard labor related to the German war effort died from exhaustion or maltreatment. Between 1942 and 1944, the Germans moved to eliminate the ghettos in occupied Poland and elsewhere, deporting ghetto residents to extermination camps, killing centers equipped with gassing facilities located in Poland. You have to remember there were two different kinds of camps. There were work camps and there were extermination camps. The difference was that in the work camp, you were fed very little and worked hard, and you might be able to survive. In the death camps, you were swiftly often taken right to the gas chamber. After the meeting of senior German government officials in late January 1942 in a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, the decision to implement the final solution of the Jewish question became formal state policy. And Jews from Western Europe were also sent to killing centers in the East. The 6 killing sites were chosen because of their closeness to rail lines and their location in semi-rural areas at Belz, Sobibor, Treblinka, Chelmnot, Madnak, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. One of the things that the Jewish communities in Western Europe, in the United States, Canada, England, tried to get the Allies to bomb some of these railroad sections so they could stop the shipment of Jews to the gas chambers. And the Allies refused to do so for various reasons, whether it was legitimate or not. I leave that to others to argue over. But the Germans used their rail lines, even when they could have used it for war purposes, to ship Jews to concentration camps, to death camps. Now, Chelmno was the first camp in which mass executions were carried out by gas, piped into mobile gas vans. 150,000 persons were killed there between December 1941 and March 1943, and June to July of 1944. Another killing center using gas vans and later gas chambers operated at Belzec, where more than 600,000 people were killed between May 1942 and August 1943. Sobibor opened in May 1942 and closed one day after rebellion of the prisoners on October 14, 1943. Up to 200,000 people were killed by gassing. Treblinka opened in July 1942. It closed in November 1943. A revolt by prisoners in early August 1943 destroyed much of the facility. At least 750,000 people were killed at Treblinka, physically the largest of the killing centers. Almost all the victims at Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were Jews. A few were Roma. Very few individuals survived those 4 killing centers, or most victims were murdered immediately after arrival. One of the things that would happen when the trains deposited their cattle, the men and women who were forced into the cattle cars and shoved into them and packed in tight without being able to even sit down, with no means of defecating, no means for eating and drinking. And you were examined. If you looked like you were usable, you went one direction. If you were not, you went straight to the gas chamber. They were told that there were going to be showers, that they would be deloused, but instead they were locked into the rooms and gas used to exterminate them. Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is both a concentration camp and a slave labor camp, became the killing center where the largest numbers of European Jews in Roma were killed. After an experimental gassing there in September 1941 of 250 malnourished and ill Polish prisoners and 600 Russian POWs, mass murder became a daily routine. More than 1.25 million were killed at Auschwitz-Birkenau. 9 out of 10 were Jews. In addition, Roma, Soviet POWs, and ill prisoners of all nationalities died in the gas chambers. Between May 14th and July 8th, 1944, 437,402 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz in 48 trains. The Hungarian Jews, for various reasons, not because the Hungarians necessarily loved the Jews, but the Hungarian government did not turn over the Jews to the Nazis at the beginning. Only as we're getting close towards the end of the war, 1944, between May and July, the Jews were deported to Auschwitz. This was probably the largest single mass deportation during the Holocaust. A similar system was implemented at Majdanek, which also doubled as a concentration camp, and where at least 275,000 people were killed in the gas chambers or died from malnutrition, brutality, and disease. You're going to have to excuse me for a couple minutes. I'll be right back. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. I can't tell if you've been behaving yourselves or not when I was gone. I don't see any spitballs flying around, but then again, I can't really see it. Let's see something on chat here. Maybe you're chatting. None is too many. Thank you. Oh, whoops. Sorry about that. Yeah, none is too many. Thank you for that observation, John and Lakin. Okay. All right. Did you want something, Matthew? Oh, okay. All right. The methods of murder were the same in all of the killing centers, which was operated by the SS. Victims arrived at railroad freight cars, as I pointed out, sometimes passenger trains, mostly from ghettos and camps in occupied Poland, but also from every other Eastern European country that was under, in Western European country under Nazi rule. On arrival, men were separated from women and children. Prisoners were forced to undress and hand over all valuables. They were then driven naked into the gas chambers, forced, not in a car, a vehicle, forced to run, which were disguised as shower rooms, and either carbon monoxide or Zyklon B was used to asphyxiate them. The minority selected for forced labor were, after initial quarantine, vulnerable to malnutrition, exposure, epidemics, medical experiments, and brutality. Many perished as a result. The Germans carried out their systematic murder activities with the active help of local collaborators in many countries, and the acquiescence or indifference of millions of bystanders. Now, this is one of the sore points that we have to recognize and is a point of contention today. Not every Pole, not every Ukrainian cooperated with the Nazis. Too many did. And many others just stood idly by. And some Jews were murdered by the local populations together with the Nazis. And indeed, after the war, when Jews came back to some of their hometowns, they were murdered when they returned by the locals. Right? Now, there were instances of organized resistance. For example, in the fall of 1943, the Danish resistance, with the support of the local population, rescued nearly the entire Jewish community in Denmark from the threat of deportation to the east by smuggling them via a dramatic boat lift to safety in neutral Sweden. Individuals in many other countries also risked their lives to save Jews and other individuals subject to Nazi persecution. One of the most famous was Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat who led the rescue effort, which saved the lives of tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews in 1944. Resistance movements exist in almost every concentration camp and ghetto of Europe. In addition to the armed revolts at Sobibor and Treblinka, Jewish resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto led to a courageous uprising in April through May 1943, despite a predictable doomed outcome because of superior German force. And for the most part, the Jews who fought off the Germans in the Warsaw Ghetto were not helped in any manner by anyone else, whether the Allies or the local resistant forces against the Polish resistant forces. Now, in general, rescue or aid to Holocaust victims was not a priority of resistance organizations whose principal goal was to fight the war against the Germans. Nonetheless, such groups and Jewish partisans sometimes cooperate with each other to save Jews. On April 19th, 1943, for instance, members of the National Committee for the Defense of Jews, in cooperation with Christian railroad workers and the General Underground in Belgium, attacked a train leaving the Belgian transit camp of Malines, headed for Auschwitz, and succeeded in assisting several hundred Jewish deportees to escape. After the war turned against Germany and the Allied armies approached German soil in late 1944, the SS decided to evacuate outlying concentration camps. The Germans tried to cover up the evidence of genocide and deported prisoners to camps inside Germany to prevent their liberation. Many inmates died along the long journeys on foot known as death marches. During the final days in the spring of 1945, conditions in the remaining concentration camps exacted a terrible toll in human lives. Even concentration camps never intended for extermination, such as Bergen-Belsen, became death traps for thousands, including famous Anne Frank, who died of typhus there in March 1945. In May 1945, Nazi Germany collapsed. The SS guards fled and the camp ceased to exist as extermination, forced labor, concentration camp. However, some of the concentration camps were later turned into camps for displaced persons, DPs camps, which included former Holocaust victims. Nutrition, sanitary conditions, and accommodations were often poor. DPs lived behind barbed wire and exposed to humiliating treatment and at times to anti-Semitic attacks. So that is a basic outline review of what we call the Holocaust. It came into being as a result of many factors. It came into being because there was a history of anti-Semitism. The church had preached anti-Semitic theology for many generations. Jews were seen as Christ killers. The Jews during the Middle Ages were never completely accepted in most communities. They were a separate entity, and thus they were competition. They were ethnically different, so that creates its own problems. But it was exacerbated with the rise of racial theories, which sought to divide people into races. And they kept making smaller and smaller groups. Jews constituted a race. There was a German race. There was a Polish or Slavic race. These are all genetic ideas. Genetics meant you were good or bad, and nothing to do with your behavior. And that's still with us today. We still have people who preach these same kinds of ideologies, who we've seen not just against Jews, we've seen in various places in the world. In Africa, the Hutus and Tutsis, we had the Yazidi, I think I'm saying it right, in Iraq when the in the Syrian civil war, when you had the Islamic State come into being, and they saw these people as being outsiders and killed or enslaved or what have you. But in terms of mass, in terms of numbers, in terms of government participation, in terms of bureaucratization of it, there's been nothing like the Holocaust of the Second World War. It was organized. It wasn't riots. It wasn't people even pushed by the government into things. It was rounding up by authorities, putting into camps, putting to forced labor, putting into death camps. And that is what is so different about it. Theologically, Yazidis, right, thank you. Brian, you're in charge of making sure I know what I'm saying. Yeah. Okay, no problem. Where was I there before I got distracted? Okay. Theologically, without question, this is a challenge. Now, you have some in the Jewish community, especially in the very right-wing orthodoxy world, who say that the Holocaust was punishment for Jews' misbehavior, for the German Jews becoming too much like Germans and the Polish Jews too much like the Poles, assimilation, turning away from Jewish tradition, turning away from study of Torah. I don't know how prevalent that is in that community. It does exist. And we hear about it from time to time, and it's condemned by many voices even in that community. To say that this was a result of divine punishment is just too overwhelming. If I do something, I'm an adult, all right, I get punished, okay, I can understand that. But a child, an innocent child, a baby, thrown into the gas chamber, 1 million children perished. So that attempt, even though it is certainly in keeping with a certain traditional line of Jewish theology, just seems too much. Then there are those who, of course, they just abandon God altogether. There's nothing divine about what took place during the Holocaust, no punishment, no reward. It was just man's inhumanity to man. And obviously there's no God, because if there were a God, he would not allow such a thing to happen. Others trying to find some way to deal with it. One of my revered teachers, Dr. David Weiss Halivni, who survived, he was in Belgium, Birkenau. If I remember, I'll look it up. He was in a work camp as 13, 14 years of age. And he survived. He tells this story that he was too young to do heavy work, but he would carry what the drill heads. Drill heads, what it meant was you would have iron drills. They would hammer it into the rock. That was a drill. And they would get dull after a period of time. They had to be sharpened. So his job was to carry these drills for resharpening to wherever it had to go. And one day, when he was delivering this to someplace, and one of the camp guards, I think he was Ukrainian, doesn't matter. he was eating his sandwich. He unwrapped his sandwich, and the paper that it was wrapped in, Dr. Livni saw that it was covered with Hebrew. Surreptitiously, he grabbed it when nobody could see it, and took it back with him. And it was a page from the Shulchan Aruch, the Jewish law, code of law. And they shared that in the barracks, and they studied it over and over again, maintaining their Jewish connections. After the war, and he has a book called Breaking the Tablets, which explains his philosophy of Jewish studies and his theology. And he is a religious man. He, while his methodology is not what found in the normative Orthodox circles, his personal belief system was very much clearly in an Orthodox style. The way he explains it, he relies on a concept that we haven't gotten to in Lurianic Kabbalah of God's withdrawal and from the world. In a nutshell, God, in order to create the world, creates an emptiness within himself, as it were, a place devoid of God. In order to give human beings greater freedom, more space, more distance is created between the divine and the human. And as that distance expands, God's influence in the world seems to diminish, and human activity can go into terrible directions. And we, in the last bit of human history, have been in one of those periods of time when God has been contracting into himself, and thus the Holocaust comes into being, because it's not that God causes it, but the absence of God allows for it. I don't know. I do know that when we look at the Holocaust, we have to remember it was not a divine act. It was not an act of nature. It wasn't an earthquake that one can argue God caused the earthquake or God caused the storm or didn't cause the storm. It was caused by human beings and by human indifference. The Holocaust would not have happened had people not cooperated in it. It happened because too many people were prepared to follow orders without question, to follow leadership which led to such horrible acts, and was allowed to happen because people were more concerned about their well-being, their safety, or they lost any belief that they should care about the other. And so I do feel comfortable and confident in saying that the Holocaust was clearly a human creation, caused by people, done by people, carried out through the actions of people. Where God fits into it, though, that's for the theologians to argue and decide how they want to understand it. But it does remain clear that people are the reason. Some people even use religion to defend themselves for their actions, and some took their religion seriously and fought against what was taking place. Those of us who were born after the Holocaust, never went through it, didn't experience anything like it, cannot understand it. Those who really went through it and experienced it are slowly disappearing from the scene. And as that happens, more and more you will get deniers of the Holocaust. They'll say it didn't happen, or didn't happen that way. It wasn't 6 million Jews. It was a smaller number. It was because the Nazis, in collaboration with the Zionists, wanted to create a Jewish state And so they cooperated so that the state of Israel could come into being. But, and we have to be aware of it. We have to teach it and have to keep it in people's minds. All right, it's not a very uplifting class tonight, but I think it's a very important one. I was sitting on a Beit Din actually just this week, and one of the individuals who came before the court, and I told them what I'm going to tell you right now. Just in the Talmud, the section of Talmud that we're studying right now on a daily basis, is a section that talks about conversion to Judaism. And so what it says in that passage is that if a person wants to convert, they say to him, basically, are you crazy? Jews are hated. They're discriminated against. They're in such problems in the world today. Why do you want that? But do you really want to belong to that people? And if he says, even though I'm not worthy, I want to be a part, then you take him to the mikveh. But it is important for you to remember that while Hitler understood if you were born with Jewish genes, Jewish genealogy, you were a Jew. If you accept Judaism, you become a genetic Jew as well. God forbid it should ever happen again. But it can and will in different ways. Not, during the worst of the plane hijackings, Jews were sometimes separated from the rest of the passengers on airplanes because of Israel and the struggle between the Palestinians. Anti-Semitism has had the biggest rise in recent years. The Anti-Defamation League just put out a study of last year saying how a huge increase in anti-Semitic acts have taken place. So Judaism is a wonderful religion. It has wonderful things about it. And I think anybody who wants to live a Jewish life can have a life that is very meaningful and fulfilling. But you have to remember, there are also those who don't like Jews. And it makes no difference what you look like. If you can pass for being a Jew or not pass for being a Jew, you can pass for being a Polish individual or Ukrainian or English or Irish or whatever it may be. When you step out of the mikveh, you have accepted upon yourself the Jewish tradition and the Jewish faith. So it should always be a good faith. It should always be a good thing. But please, you have to remember that's part of the package. So it's a full package, the historical and the future, past and present and future. Please God, we should only have a glorious future for all of humanity. But we see, all you have to do is look what's happening right now. People being killed because they live on the wrong side of a border. They may speak the same language and all of that, but because they're on the Ukrainian side of the border, they're being killed by those who are on the Russian side of the border. So, any questions for tonight? Okay. We will have class next week. I will once again be out of town. I'm going to again be in New York with my grandchildren, celebrating a bar mitzvah. At least this one we can go to. The last bar mitzvah we had to miss. So, but for this for Azaria's bar mitzvah, we will be there. Please God. Okay. Yes, Brian.
Good question. In your comparison to Ukraine and Russia, how would you compare Putin? Well, okay, this maybe is a bit of a loaded question, but do you see similarities between Putin and someone like Hitler? I know that's a crazy loaded question.
I would say the following. Anybody who becomes a dictator begins to see the world as something they need to control. And anyone who doesn't bow to that control is the enemy. That is certainly the case. I don't think that Putin has espoused any kind of specific anti-Ukrainian people statements, as you know, Hitler did with Jews. I don't know what he feels about the average man in the street in Kiev, or the average woman in Lvov, or wherever it may be. He has a vision for Russia, and he seems to have that. For him, that vision includes Ukraine being either part of Russia or certainly subdued by Russia. And in that, he's like every dictator's around who wants, to run the show. The bigger, the better. But there's a big difference between what's happening in Ukraine, which is terrible. And certainly the crimes against humanity are legitimate statements about it. It's not systematic attempt to wipe out Ukrainians. That's the big difference. Hitler sought to wipe out peoples, Jews especially, but others as well. And so they're two different things. That doesn't make Putin an angel by any stretch of the imagination, but he's not in the same caliber as a Hitler. If Hitler is in the major league, Putin is in the minor leagues. Sports analogy. I'm not often I go to sports analogies. That one was a home run. Oh, okay. All right. Okay, everybody, have a good week, and see you next week. And like I say, I'll be out of town. I will be doing it. Last time I did it on my tablet, and I don't think it was the best connection all the time. But we will certainly try to have the class the next week. We'll be talking about Israel, the history of Israel, and a little more of a happy story. Okay? Good night.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.